The worst accident ever was Chernobyl, which resulted in 50-something deaths. But the interesting thing about that is most people don't understand the other two reactors at the Chernobyl site continued to operate for another 14 years after that meltdown. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
all right, Justin, thank you for doing this. I appreciate your time and sorry that the first go around the schedule got all messed up.
No worries. Glad we were able to make it happen.
Me too. I love the background, by the way. It's cool. You got the uraniuminsider.com there and I actually, I'll be honest, I'm not invested in any uranium. I know very little about uranium. So I'm excited to hear about that and your story, how you got involved, and yeah, if you want to just take that question as you will. What is your story?
Oh, gosh. Well, I've been interested in investing in the markets for, now we're probably pushing 15 years. I started out just sort of dabbling in trading. I was lucky enough to meet somebody who kind of took me under their wing, who's a very, very skilled technical trader. So this is more like momentum breakouts, trend following type trading. I did that for quite a few years with a decent amount of success and started to notice that when I knew something about the company or the industry of a stock that I was trading, it influenced the outcome of that trade. So, for example, I had learned technical trading so that you were not supposed to know absolutely anything about the company or the sector. You wanted to trade the charts in a completely unbiased manner, right? So you wanted to look at volume and chart patterns and whatever it might be, right? Indicators. But for example, if I found that a certain chart pattern that was a bullish breakout, for example, on good volume had to do with some fundamental development for the company that seemed to have future promise for continued growth for the company, then that would add to my conviction for holding that technical trade. And most of the time, the outcome of that technical breakout would continue to pan out in a bullish manner, let's say. So that was sort of like a fundamental started to trickle into the technical trading, I guess is a simpler way to put it. Then kind of fast forward to 2016 is when I first heard the kind of the investing thesis for uranium mining stocks and nuclear energy in general. I had not ever really at that point made any sort of sizable fundamental investment, especially in a contrarian manner where you're looking at a sector that's just utterly bombed out that nobody cares about whatsoever. The commodity was trading at multi-year lows, well below the average cost of production. And just I got interested in the sector, well, first of all, due to the volatility and the types of returns that investors saw in the previous bull market for the commodity. So 2004 to 2007, there was a bull market for uranium of epic proportions where you saw starting out with maybe a dozen companies in the space publicly traded, and 3 years later, pushing 500 companies. Sorry for the background noise.
No, you're fine. What caused that 407? What caused that explosion?
The price in the commodity went from less than $10 a pound to $134 a pound. Yeah, in about 4 years' time. So, and the reasons for that are many, but really it was a many years of a bear market for the commodity and a seller's market, an oversupplied market that finally took a while to work through that oversupply and see kind of and at least approaching a structural shift into a supply deficit, but we never actually got into a supply deficit in the previous bull market. But there was the perception of supply shocks. So one big example and one reason that really set the price of the uranium kind of to go up on stilts and the equities follow was one of the biggest mines in the world, Cigar Lake, which is in Saskatchewan, Canada, operated by Cameco and Orano. That mine was being developed during that cycle. So it was in development in the years leading up to it. And then 2000, I think it was 2005 was the first time that it flooded. That mine flooded while it was very close to actually getting into production. So you had nuclear utilities kind of expecting new production to come online, and this mine flooded and it set the price kind of on fire. So, but understanding a little bit about the previous market at the time, I started to educate myself on it and got interested just based on the potential for large investment returns is really what initially got me interested. that there's this sector that is trading for very, very low valuations, the companies and the commodity itself. And so this was a bet on nuclear still being a slight growth story, maybe growing 1%, maybe 2% per year on the good side of things. The commodity eventually moving back towards the price, the cost of production, which at the time was probably in the $40 a pound range. And it's already moved up to that level. But since that time, we've gotten into a whole nother set of circumstances for the investment thesis. And
So
I continue to learn about it. Go ahead.
real quick, just so you brought up nuclear, which I didn't even think to preface this conversation, because in my mind, uranium is used in nuclear power plants, and that's the big utility for it. Are there other utilities that uranium is being used for that might have caused this price spike as well, or is it really just pure nuclear power transformation as our society moves towards renewable energy? Is that kind of what's causing this, or are there other use cases for uranium as well? I should probably preface that for the rest of this conversation, just for both myself and other listeners who maybe haven't even heard of uranium in its use at all.
The primary usage is fuel for nuclear power plants. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And and the demand that comes from those is pretty static and pretty reliable. And the reason is the nuclear power plants are very long-lived assets. They cost billions and billions of dollars to build, and they operate for 60 to 80 plus years in some cases. So once they're up and running, there's such a big sunk cost in getting the thing built and operational that the operational costs going forward are not negligible, but they're small relative to the sunk cost. And so you have nuclear power plants will produce energy for decades and decades and decades. So while there's subtle changes, there's some premature closures and there's life extensions. There's more life extensions now than closures. That affects the demand outlook, of course, but it's relatively static and reliable to model out that demand. There's some use cases for radioactive isotopes that come from the enrichment process of uranium that's used in the medical industry. And then, of course, there's nuclear warheads, but that's not typically coming from like uranium that's being mined out of the ground right now. There's not a whole lot of these things, and they only take a certain amount of uranium. So basically, it's for demand coming from the actual nuclear reactors producing electricity.
Okay. That's what I thought. But you're the insider, not me, so I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, all good.
I can let you continue down. So before I interrupted you, you were talking about the 0407. There's this big boom in demand. And then did it come back down to those $10 or $40 prices? What was kind of the next step in that journey for uranium?
Well, the commodity actually topped out in 07. That was just before the great financial crisis. And sorry for the background noise again.
Oh, you're good.
So there was a lot of financial speculation that pushed it to that price. So there was natural kind of demand forces coming from nuclear utilities and commodities traders that pushed it, north of $100. But that spike up to 134 was like hedge funds buying and things like that. So that spiked and it came back down. It started to fall back down. It fell back down to a much higher low. I think it was in the 50s or 60s dollars per pound. Started to climb again because you had this situation where China was announcing they were building a lot of nuclear power plants, and they continue to do so. So you had this pretty robust demand outlook, and the commodity price started to recover again. It got up into the 70s dollars per pound, and then Fukushima Daiichi accident happened. That was 2011. And that was something that definitely hurt sentiment, at least in the short term. And honestly, kind of for the midterm, for a while after Fukushima, sentiment around nuclear remained relatively poor. But the big deal following that accident was the closure of the entire Japanese nuclear fleet. 53 reactors shut down over the course of like 12 months.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah.
So real quick, so I have heard of this, but for anyone that hasn't heard of the accident, can you explain real quickly just what happened there?
Yeah, well, there's the earthquake that caused the tsunami, and the tsunami ended up flooding so the earthquake basically shut off the operations of the plant, but obviously there's continues to be radioactive fuel rods that are within the reactor core, and those have to be kept cool by a constant flow of water. So when the main electricity source gets shut off, the backup source is diesel generators. And so these diesel generators got flooded by the tsunami. And so the backup source of water flow to keep the fuel rods cool, that stopped. And so basically the reactor overheated and released radiation into the atmosphere. Interestingly enough, the actual meltdown caused the core to melt down. It just gets too hot and it melts down.
Yeah.
That accident resulted in 0 human deaths from like radiation. There were unfortunately a few people that died in the evacuation of the surrounding areas, but radiation from that actually did not take a single human life.
Oh, that's actually not talked about. I fully assumed there were dozens of deaths due to radiation. I had no idea that there were no. Were there any sicknesses, lawsuits? I imagine those things were happening too. Or I guess not too, just so those were happening.
Not to my knowledge. They
Wow.
evacuated the area
Wow.
relatively quickly, and the radiation exposure that came from the accident was significant if you were at the plant. But for the surrounding areas, it's to my understanding, there hasn't really been a fallout from that accident.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
shocking due to the, I
right.
guess, the sentiment that happened that has come from that. And I'm not a uranium insider, and even I've heard of that accident. And it's one of those things that gets brought up whenever the nuclear conversation gets brought up. That's amazing. I feel like it should be brought up in the other sense then that, hey, look, when something did go wrong, look at how well things actually turned out. That's kind of incredible. I didn't know that.
Yeah. There's so much fear associated with anything nuclear, just probably because it shares a name with the nuclear warheads that have obviously created immense damage and destruction and loss of life. But nuclear reactors have an incredibly safe history. In fact, if you actually measure lives lost per kilowatt hour, megawatt hour, however you want to measure it, generated of electricity, it's the safest form of electricity ever. That even compared to solar or wind, you've got accidents that happen in the construction or on rooftops, whatever it might be. It's the safest form of electricity that's ever been conceived. The worst accident ever was Chernobyl, which resulted in 50 something deaths. But the interesting thing about that is most people don't understand the other 2 reactors at the Chernobyl site continued to operate for another 14 years after that meltdown. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
And that reactor had no containment field. And so modern reactors have very thick containment domes over the reactor core, which typically contains a lot of the radiation damage. Like 3 Mile Island is probably the most famous one in the United States. And that again resulted in 0 deaths. There were a handful of radiation related lawsuits. They were all thrown out. There was no proven connection between any sort of illnesses following that. And basically the reactor's design did its job. There was a partial
what
meltdown, but the
what is
containment field
Three
contained
Mile?
it.
So I haven't. This isn't actually, to my knowledge, a famous accident. 3 Mile Island. I haven't heard of this. So what happened there? Where was that?
Yeah, so this is in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
This accident happened in 1979. This was actually before Chernobyl. Netflix even released a series around Chernobyl recently, and then there was another one about 3 Mile Island not that long ago. But no, it was a meltdown, and it was right around the time. This is late 70s. There was kind of heightened fear around just kind of like Cold War era Cuban Missile Crisis, that sort of thing, and
Mhm.
there was a lot of fear around anything labeled nuclear, and so there was a partial meltdown in one of the reactors at the 3 Mile Island, but it was completely contained within the containment dome that was designed to do such a thing. So that's all just to say that while there obviously are drawbacks and downsides and some risk associated with everything, nuclear is included in that, it's an extremely safe electricity source. It's extremely safe and produces no emissions whatsoever in its generation. So that's kind of the unique thing about it. I mean, honestly, getting into the investment case, I learned a lot about nuclear energy that I didn't understand, and so I've become a pretty unabashed advocate for nuclear going forward, and we can go down that rabbit hole if you want. But
Yo, I'd
yeah,
love to. I'd love to at some point in this conversation. I've always argued for nuclear energy because when I get into those political debates, that it's always made sense to me, and I've never heard anyone come up with a reason that's valid on, hey, this is why we shouldn't do this. And I've had the pushback on, Chernobyl and more well-known accidents, but yeah, no, I'd love to get some more bullets in my chamber, so to speak, on that argument. But I'll let you get us all the way caught up on the stock prices and the rise and the falls and all of that. So in Japan after the accident, all of their, you think you said 53 nuclear sites shut down?
Yes,
And
all of them.
yeah, so what year was this?
2011.
2011. Okay. Dang, so that obviously has a huge impact on demand. So the price is
Yeah,
going
it
to start
was
coming
it
back
was
down
about
at
a
that point.
10% of the world's demand at the time, just offline overnight. So what happens in this industry is like in-ground uranium deposits take a very, very long time and a hell of a lot of money to develop and get into production. And then most of the production goes into long-term contracts, the nuclear utilities. So when the demand fell off so quickly from Japan, a lot of the production continued to increase or continued to come into the fuel cycle and into the nuclear fuel market, especially coming from Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan now is the largest producing country of uranium in the world. And at the time that Fukushima was happening, they still were kind of an up and coming producer and growing very, very quickly. And they were 100% state owned. Kazatomprom is the entity that mines uranium in Kazakhstan. They were 100% state owned, and there was a big sort of arbitrage to play on their national currency, the Kazakh tenge. So their expenses, labor costs, materials costs, et cetera, were and are in tenge, but they sell in US dollars. So you had this massive depreciation of the tenge against the dollar, and they just went balls to the wall production. So they went from not producing any uranium whatsoever at the beginning of the century to producing upwards of 60 million pounds a year. And they're the biggest producer on the planet right now. So they continued to ramp production as demand was falling because of Japanese shutdowns. That led to many years of oversupply, steep and precipitous decline of the price of the commodity. So it went from around 70 something dollars when Fukushima accident happened, all the way down to $18 a pound in 2016, which was the bottom of the commodity.
Wow. So was Kazakhstan sitting on that supply? Were they selling it to, I imagine, not Japan? Were they just expecting that, hey, this is going to have a huge comeback? Do you know the reasoning behind ramping up that inventory so much?
Well, the basic reason is money. I mean, they did it because they could. They discovered that they have an incredible wealth of uranium resources in the ground in the country, and they could sell it even in a declining price environment at a profit because of their depreciating currency. And the fact that it was state owned and still at the time, and still to some extent now, although to what extent could be argued, had considerable influence from Russia. So you could potentially, the conspiracy theories around this whole thing would be that Russia had an influence on the Kazakh state uranium producers to flood the market with cheap uranium, because one of the fallouts from that oversupply and the massively depreciating price of the commodity was that the industry got killed in certain places, especially in the United States. The United States now produces basically zero uranium. The biggest fleet on the planet, 93 reactors, don't produce any of the fuel. And we have plenty of uranium in the States.
When did we stop mining? Was it around that 2011, 2016 time? Because
It was during the last decade. Yeah. Yeah.
it was just cheaper to get it from Kazakhstan, I assume. That's the
Correct.
reason why.
Correct. Yeah.
Wow.
So the nuclear utilities could buy, the Kazakhstan mining did not fall under any sort of restriction. So there's restrictions in the United States around Russian uranium. It's called the Russian Suspension Agreement, which limits to about 20% of the uranium that nuclear utilities can get from Russia, but there's no limitations on Kazakh. So they sold it into the market. They sold it to utilities. They sold it into the spot market. They sold it to traders. They just flooded the market with uranium when the demand fell off a cliff because of Japan. So that led to a brutal bear market. Equities got crushed, companies disappeared, and the survivors had huge, huge share price declines from the peak, hung on by the skin of their teeth. And finally, we got the bottom of the commodity in 2016, $18 a pound, started to reverse, and the outlook for nuclear started to improve. Even at that point, because I actually happened to learn about this thesis like literally within a month of the bottom of the commodity. So that, I suppose, that was quite lucky for me, even though the equities didn't really do much for another 2 years or 3 years, actually, for that matter. The market really took off in 2020. And between the low commodity of 2016 and 2020, the commodity about doubled by that time. It was in the low 30s, I believe, per pound. But all of the other elements of the fuel cycle, so conversion and enrichment, or these other processes that have to take the mined uranium to get it to fabricated fuel for the reactors. Yeah. That's the nuclear fuel cycle. Those elements started to recover as well in price and demand. And honestly, it's gone from this thesis of just betting on the commodity, getting back at reasonable prices and the equities, making a decent move, to kind of a full-blown nuclear renaissance that we're kind of finding ourselves in now, and seeing energy crises and climate concerns or carbon emission concerns, and those two things sort of coalescing into an increasing recognition that nuclear is likely to play a very important role going forward and for clean energy for the planet. So we've seen a lot of countries that have abandoned nuclear in the past shifting and re-embracing it and actually building new plants, like South Korea. Japan has restarted 11 reactors, and they're shooting to have 20 to 22% of their grid nuclear by 2030, which would be another 15 to 20 reactors restarted. The UK is building new plants. The United States is giving more life extensions and supporting nuclear operators with the Inflation Reduction Act. France is building new reactors. And then there's this thing called SMR, small modular reactors, which is gaining a lot of enthusiastic speed here with these much smaller, cheaper to build reactors that have different safety mechanism built into them as well. And that's not even started yet. That's kind of happening slowly, but probably going to be a pretty big thing going out into the next decade.
Interesting. The SMRs. So other than being smaller, what's the advantage there? I assume they're cheaper. Are they more safe? What's the advantage there? When are those getting out? And I guess when will one of those be running? Where will those be running? That's interesting. I've never heard of those.
The first one is going to be up and running in China for sure. They're furthest along in their build of the first small modular reactor. Honestly, the biggest benefit, in my opinion, is public perception. Because really, the parts of a large-scale reactor can be factory built and shipped and assembled. In fact, they are, and that's one of the proposed benefits of SMRs, is that the facility can literally be kind of fleet mode built in factories and shipped and assembled on site. And because they're much smaller, that cost can be substantially minimized. There's other design differences in a lot of the designs for SMRs. So there's these quote unquote advanced nuclear designs like gas cooled reactors and molten salt reactors. And these are different types of, like, most of the reactors in the world right now are boiling water reactors, light water reactors. There's a handful of what are called CANDU reactors. These are heavy water reactors that don't use enriched uranium, but I'm not a nuclear engineer, so my understanding of these different plant designs is somewhat cursory. But these advanced reactors designs, they operate on a different type of fuel, which is called high assay low enriched uranium, or HALEU, and the enrichment level is higher. And so they operate with a bit more efficiency. They can operate at much higher temperatures and actually produce like industrial heat that can be utilized for industrial processes that need very high temperature heat. But really, the public perception about them being smaller, I think, has a different level of understanding and acceptance of nuclear, with this sort of repackaging of essentially a really fancy way to boil water is really what nuclear reactors are. It's a very, very complex way to make steam. That's pretty much what nuclear reactors do. And you can make that small and you can make it safer and cheaper. I think that people will embrace it more and will actually see some of these reactors come online. So when is this happening? The Chinese are building one right now. They just broke ground and building a GE Hitachi SMR in Canada. And the United States Department of Energy actually has a program, a demonstration program, where they're fiscally funding the majority of the initial costs to develop the first of the kind of two different designs. So one is called the Natrium reactor from a company called TerraPower that was started by Bill Gates and company. And another one is called the XE100, a company called X Energy. And those two reactors are both advanced reactors running on high assay low enriched uranium that should be able to be operational, by the end of the decade.
Very cool. Very cool. It's interesting that you say the biggest part of that is the public perception. So it feels like that's been the biggest fight for nuclear is not the innovation of, is it efficient enough? Is it going to be cost effective? Is it going to be safe enough? It really does seem to be purely is the public going to accept it? Are politicians going to accept it? And are they going to be able to because their supporters will accept? So all of that is just human acceptance of it. So it's interesting that the fact that the word's smaller and they're just smaller seems to have a good effect on that, because that wouldn't have been my guess. I wouldn't have been like, hey, how do you make people okay with nuclear? Well, let's just make it smaller. I would never have guessed that was the answer to that. I would have guessed more education about, I mean, there's facts I've learned here already. Just it's the safest form of energy as far as nuclear, and when you compare it to solar or wind energy, well, there's people dying during construction, and there's definitely a ton of misconception on when accidents happen, the death toll that happens, and the destruction of the surrounding environment that happens. There's definitely a ton of misconception there, but it's funny how the semantics of a word can just help fix that issue. Yeah, that's pretty incredible in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, I think SMRs address some of the common talking points of opposition to nuclear. One of the big ones is the cost and the time it takes to build, right? So those are the big, especially for coming from proponents of solar. So they can say, well, you can produce the same amount of kilowatt hours from solar. You can get it up in less than a year. Of course, it's not the same type of energy. It's intermittent energy and requires, battery backup systems or gas or coal power plants to be burning when the sun's not shining. But that is an argument that's there. And certainly there's plenty of cases of major time frame and cost overruns. So if the time frame can be shortened to get one of these things built or multiple built, and if the cost can be lowered, I think that's a big talking point. The other one would be safety. So some of these designs have completely passive safety systems in place. So you're not relying on human error or lack thereof to avoid some type of even partial meltdown scenario. Some of the fuels are literally meltdown proof. They like these designs literally cannot have a meltdown. So I think that addresses another issue. And then the last issue that people argue about usually is nuclear waste. Well, what about the waste? What about the waste? What about the waste? It's going to be radioactive for 100,000 years. What about the waste? There's never been an accident with nuclear waste. It's the only waste product from energy production that is extremely highly regulated. And the waste, so for example, the amount of waste that is produced based on the amount of energy that's produced is very, very small. And for example, the United States has the largest fleet on Earth. We've been operating nuclear power plants since the 50s. There's a big nuclear renaissance in the 80s. And since the 50s, all of the waste that's ever been produced by nuclear reactors in the United States will fit on a football field 30 feet high. That's how much waste is there from nuclear energy in this country. So It's highly regulated. We know how to deal with it. It literally isn't a problem. And so it's one of those things where it's like, it's ultra safe, ultra regulated, and it remains mildly radioactive for a very, very long time. It doesn't remain highly radioactive for very long. That dissipates relatively quickly once it's in its long-term storage casks.
Interesting. Just to push back, I guess, if something were to go wrong, let's say, I don't know what would have to happen. A fire breaks out and everything explodes. And if something were to go wrong with that football field of radioactive waste, what would be the result of that? Would there be a specific radius of the land that, hey, you just can't go on here for 50 years? Like, it just if I was gonna be somebody arguing with you on a debate stage here, if we were on a political debate stage and I was arguing against nuclear, I'd say, well, you're saying it's not a problem, but what if it does happen? What would be your answer to that?
Are you talking about with waste?
With the waste, yeah.
Well, the waste, so the way that the waste is stored is within a cylindrical cask that has super thick layers of concrete and steel. So it's totally fireproof. I mean, these things have been tested. You can fly a jet into the side of one of these things. You can drop them from 50 feet in the air. It's highly, highly unlikely that there will ever be a breach of some kind of these casks. But if there were, the amount of radiation that would be leaking out would not, I mean, you wouldn't have to evacuate the nearby town or anything like that. Of course, it depends on how recently the fuel rods went into the cask. So it goes from being still relatively radioactive at the time that they go into long-term storage, because they go into long-term storage after spending a number of years in a cooling pool. So they come out of the reactor core, then they go in a cooling pool of water to burn off whatever excess heat is there. And they spend a few years there doing that. And then they go into long-term storage. And water is an extremely viable way to block radiation. So, for example, you can have highly radioactive spent fuel rods in the bottom of a pool that's, let's say, 20 feet deep. You can do laps on the surface of that pool and not have radiation exposure, right? It's like it blocks.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. But by the time they go into the casks, they've already burned off a lot of their radiation, and they remain still decently highly radioactive for a handful of years. But like every year that passes, it drops off significantly. And then they're mildly radioactive for 100,000 years or something like that, but not to the point where it would ever like cause any sort of radioactive damage if they were to be opened up or broken through or whatever it might be. So there's never, like I said, there's never been a problem or an accident with the waste in the history of nuclear. So
Wow. It's just the more I'm talking to you, the more I'm sold on, yeah, why have we not done this for the last 30, 40, 50 years already? It's kind of wild.
there's plenty of people that think that if it was discovered right now, it would be hailed as like the savior of humanity. It would be like, oh, this is the climate change solution. This is the clean energy solution. This is the energy crisis solution. It's just, we're still working through poor sentiment and misinformation that comes from, largely, honestly, comes from fossil fuel companies. I mean, you can actually find propaganda that's anti-nuclear or propaganda that's pro-solar and wind coming from the fossil fuel companies, because every time a nuclear power plant closes, when they tell you, so for example, they closed Indian Point in New York State a year and a half ago. That was a perfectly good reactor that could have kept operating for decades. They shut that down because the Natural Resources Defense Council, or whatever it is, in the NGO, pushed against it and made it happen. So their solution is to buy hydroelectricity from Canada and have that shipped, sent down to, and this one nuclear plant provided, I think it was like 20 to 25% of the electricity needed in New York City. Okay. So that's a lot of electricity.
Yeah.
But what they don't understand is that during peak demand in Canada, they have the option to not send that. So basically, they're going to be relying, and they already have been and will continue to be relying on natural gas power. They shut down nuclear, natural gas picks up the pieces. That's what happens every damn time, because renewables are not baseload. And you can't replace baseload with non-baseload. You just can't. They can share the space. You can have up to a certain percentage of intermittent energy within a grid without causing too much stability, but you have to have base load that can cycle up and down to buffer.
What is base load?
Always on.
Always on. Yeah, that makes sense. Honestly, it's actually funny that I in hindsight, that's kind of a no-duh. We were going to kind of get a little bit political here because uranium, renewable energy is just a political topic. But it is funny that it's one of those topics that actually does seem to be partisan, where I'll see our friends on both sides. I'll see on Twitter on both sides, wherever it is, that there's so many people against nuclear, and it doesn't really surprise me coming from the right, where it's like, well, yeah, the right's kind of the team of oil, so to speak. I know there's definitely both sides to that going on, but what always did surprise me was when it was coming from people that their number one thing was climate change. That was the number one thing they wanted to fight, which those people on the left, and when they would be against it, and it just, that kind of caught me off guard. And they always go back to solar's better, wind's better, whatever this is, it's all better. And when asking for that information, you gave me a light bulb moment where, of course, it's coming from the fossil fuel companies, because they're not always on, and there has to be coal, fossil fuels, whatever it is, that is going to support those, whether there's no wind at the time, whether it's night or whatever it is. That makes so much sense that would happen, and that became the partisan point that it is. Wow, yeah, I just like, it's one of those moments where, yeah,
you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, and that's slowly shifting. It's slowly shifting because you actually have a certain percentage of the quote unquote environmental left that are now in support of nuclear, and a lot of that happened sort of in part from pushback coming from the nuclear advocate side, which is a few years ago, this is something I talk about a lot because I thought it was so funny. you had the Green New Deal that was proposed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and a number of other legislators on the left that basically literally made the claims that we were in an existential crisis and could face essentially extinction in the next 10 years because of climate change due to carbon emissions, but no nuclear. And I was like, you can't have both those things. You really think that carbon is going to kill you, but the thing that produces no carbon, you're not going to allow. That doesn't make any sense. You don't get both of those things. And they got a lot of pushback from that. And since then, we've seen, things like the Green Nuclear Deal and people like Michael Schellenberger that have been very loud advocates for nuclear, especially along the lines of climate change and reducing carbon emissions and all of that. But it's slowly shifting. It's slowly shifting. And you actually, I mean, now with the Biden presidency, we've had more support for domestic nuclear than we've ever seen. And a lot of that has to do with the people that he has in the Department of Energy being nuclear advocates. And I think they understand that most people are pretty dumb, but not everybody is really dumb. And if they are going to bang the drum about climate all the freaking time, then they have to actually acknowledge the things that mathematically support that agenda. So, and that's nuclear. So whether or not you're in a panic about the climate, nuclear is one of those things that has extremely dense energy production. And that's honestly more for me, that's more of the push for it than it is around climate, because I'm not necessarily in that camp, but I am in the camp of recognizing energy return on energy invested and understanding the history of energy and going from wood to coal to oil to gas to hydro to nuclear. Every step of the way has been an increase in energy efficiency. And what we're doing right now is moving backwards. And that can't happen while also sustaining life as we know it. And maybe there's a lot about life as we know it that needs to change for reasons that have nothing to do with climate or whatever. But nuclear is far and away the most dense energy source when it comes to how much you receive based on what you've invested.
Yeah, that was actually gonna be one of my questions that I was about to ask next, because for me, as far as the climate thing goes, my study of people and history is that we're an extremely innovative species, that we're slow to react to a problem, but when we finally do, we will react so heavily, we probably overreact, but we find ways to innovate and be okay. So in my mind, once the acceptance comes, the next step is really, well, is it efficient? Is it going to be cheaper than natural gas and oil? The way that I actually didn't even know, never really put the thought into it, but we went wood to coal to oil to oil to renewables, hydro, all of that. So what is the ROI? What are the finances of this? The accounting of it? If you are putting in $1,000 into the nuclear grid versus if I was to put $1,000 into uranium and producing energy versus if I was to put $1,000 into oil and producing energy, what's the math come out to there?
So the math on the EROI, the energy return on invested, this is based on not necessarily the dollar value, but the actual amount of energy that is put into producing. And,
Yeah,
and a lot of times that is measured in dollars, right? But the energy that you get back from the energy put in to create that energy source. So for example, hold on, let me pull up a graph here really quick, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, please do. Let me make sure I'm giving you the ability to share. I'll make you co-host, and then you should be able to share.
Can you see that okay?
Yes, I can. All right. What are we looking at here? Energy return on investment.
So this is energy return on invested with or without storage. And you can find similar studies coming from all sides of the political spectrum that tend to skew these numbers in one direction or the other, right? Because you can consciously omit certain elements of the cost structure. You can emphasize other elements and sort of fudge these numbers in certain ways, right? And with nuclear, a lot of it has to do with where the reactors are built, right? So, for example, a reactor built in China is going to have an insanely high EROI compared to, let's say, even like the Vodal plant that was just built in Georgia and just reached first criticality a couple of weeks ago. It's been built. It's way, way, way over budget. And in the United States, there's just so much bureaucratic red tape that labor unions and the extremely high costs for the skilled labor to operate the thing. So you're going to have a lower EROI for a new plant in the States versus a legacy plant in another country, right? Vastly different. But on balance, still much, much higher than most other sources. So you can see solar and wind are kind of down towards the lower end of the spectrum. So wind is better than solar significantly without storage. But once you factor storage into it, and you can see why the number is identical for unbuffered and buffered with nuclear, coal, and natural gas, is because there's no storage needed. It's always on baseload. As soon as you take something like wind or solar that's intermittent, you have to calculate the cost of whatever backup system you have in place or suggesting you have. And in a lot of cases, there is no backup system. So you're just tied into a grid that you share with coal. And so you have to factor in coal energy into the EROI of solar and wind. You have to factor that into the actual emissions profile, everything, because people are still using electricity on calm nights. And so that power is coming from somewhere. But when it's actually buffered with storage, so that could be a battery system, and the battery systems are getting larger. They're not necessarily getting all that more efficient. We always hear about the next big battery breakthrough. Well, it hasn't really happened when it comes to grid scale storage. It's still relatively inefficient and expensive. And you lose energy going in and out of storage as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
But solar with storage barely even has a return on investment when it comes to the energy involved. And a lot of that has to do with, okay, well, it's so cheap. Well, the solar panels are coming from China, where they're both burning coal, and they have basically zero environmental or humanitarian regulations. That's why the solar panels are so cheap. But you can see on this grid here that nuclear is a clear winner. Now, this number, nuclear Gen 4, is pretty much off the charts. I think that number, honestly, it's improved from Gen 3 nuclear, but where it's going to land in terms of EROI, I have no idea. 750 seems pretty ridiculously high, but
yeah, no, it is literally off the charts. I was almost going to ask what that little sign was, and I looked up, it said 750. For anyone that's just listening to this, the chart that's being shown goes from 0 to 80 on the EROI. And then there's a line on that last nuclear Gen 4 where it ends up at 750. The closest one is nuclear Gen 2 and 3 at 75, hydro at 49, and that's without storage. With storage, hydro's at 35. I mean, it's night and day, the difference between nuclear and everything else. What is the difference between nuclear 2 and 3 and nuclear Gen 4? What happened? What happened with the new generation here that makes it this huge difference, potentially huge difference?
Much more efficient design and largely operating on higher enriched uranium that improves efficiencies significantly. So Gen 3 is largely, these are light water reactors, boiling water reactors. Gen 4 could be, like I said, some of these gas cooled reactors and potentially molten salt reactors someday. But these reactors are much more efficient in their design and utilizing much higher enriched uranium. But you see that line at the 10 EROI, economic threshold.
Yes.
What that basically is saying is that, everything that we do on a daily basis uses energy of some form or another, right? So, the clothes that we wear came from growing cotton in Egypt, and then it's processed in Turkey, and then it's shipped, and that uses energy. And the lights that we use, the computers that we use, the cars that we drive, like literally every single thing that we do consumes energy. And so this 10 EROI is based on an understanding that the energy that we consume in our daily lives needs to come from a source that's at least a 10 return on investment when you're measuring that energy usage, in order to maintain things how they are now. So anything less than that, and you're going to have to see some compromises in society's functioning, whatever that might look like. Anything more than that, and you can see you have the opportunity of further human progress and thriving, essentially, of humanity. And largely, I mean, I don't think it's difficult for most to understand that the world as we know it now has everything to do with the incredible ROI of oil, especially
Absolutely.
in the, you know, in the early and middle part of the last century, when we discovered massive deposits of oil, especially in, you know, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So the world as it is now that we enjoy and take for granted, it's everything to do with not, and it's not just like, oh, we found a lot of oil and gas. No, it has to do with what we got from those sources of energy compared to what we put in.
Yeah.
So the
That
fact that
makes
we're not
sense.
growing our own food and collecting our own water and knitting our own clothing and walking everywhere, we're drawing on energy. We're drawing on energy abundance, and that's where it comes from. And we've never moved in reverse, and right now we're moving in reverse. We're
It does
moving
seem
away
like
from
a
coal. Yeah.
it does seem like a time in general of contraction, so to speak. Just that it's almost like humanity is taking a breath of, hey, there's been so much progress. There's just bound to be in a bear market for humanity, so to speak. So to speak. Not that we're
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
worse off as people than we were 50 years ago or anything like that, but it does feel like that time period has been
Mhm.
happening. And as far as the energy consumption goes, the EROI, I love that in that term today because that makes so much sense. We are we're as kind of prosperity grows throughout the world, it's all about energy. And there's a grid, and I'll look it up, not a grid, a theory of types of planets versus like as in type 1 versus type 5. So it's called the Kardashev scale. Have you ever heard of this scale before?
No, I haven't.
It's very interesting. There's a really good video. I'll probably just DM you on Twitter to watch it. Nice animated video that explains it. But the scale type 1 through type 5, it's all about energy. So a type 1 civilization, let me find the exact thing here before I just blurt it out, but it's a type 1 designation is given to a species who has the ability to harness all of the energy that is available from a neighboring star. So we're not even a type 1. We are type 0.345. But the whole scale has to do with, hey, how much energy can you consume and how efficiently can you do it? And nuclear, clearly from this conversation, nuclear is clearly the way to go. And it's just that's the big thing that causes human prosperity. And it's the number one most important thing, as oil has shown. And it's, a lot of people point to oil as this horrible, terrible thing, but everything that we use comes from oil. The plastics, everything. I'm literally looking at my laptop, my mouse, my car outside. Everything has oil to make it,
Right.
and it's been so great for the human standard of living. It's incredible seeing that chart knowing that we're at a 30 or a 40, and then nuclear energy brings us to a 75. And the next generation of nuclear is going to bring us to potentially 10x just from what nuclear is right now. That gives me personally a ton of hope for humanity that this is what we need. Energy is the number one thing. And yeah, I came out of this conversation so far just feeling fantastic for humanity, which is great because I don't always do that during a political conversation. So it's so great to see.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. You know, the EROI on oil and gas is going to continue to decline as well, right? Because that was super robust with the best deposits. And I don't know where you stand on peak oil or whatever, and I'm not even sure where I stand on it, but it's quite possible that we've reached peak cheap oil at least. So I think we're going to have oil and especially natural gas for quite some time still. But those are finite resources, and we do need to find some other means of electricity, even if you're not talking about emissions or climate or anything like that. And even when you're looking at nuclear, it's like uranium is also a finite resource. There's a lot of it. It's one of the most abundant elements on the planet, but efficiencies. I mean, you really should check out this guy named Simon Michaud. Have you heard of him before?
I am not.
Michaux. He's Australian. He lives in Finland. I'm forgetting the name of the entity for which he works, but basically what he did is he worked for this organization where I think he was tasked with this question of, okay, so the EU is planning on building X number of gigafactories for battery manufacturing, for EV battery manufacturing by whatever year. How much copper is that going to take? And he was like, I don't really know. Let me look into this. He started to dig into it, was pretty gobsmacked by what he discovered, and set out on his own sort of mission to basically take, he obviously planted his flag in a pretty extreme goal, but he went off of kind of what the IAEA is saying, which is trying to get to net zero by 2050. So he's like, okay, if we're not going to use fossil fuels at all in anything by 2050, what does that look like? And so he went with their suggestions, which was a doubling of nuclear, a slight increase of geothermal and hydro, marginal increase in wind, and then the rest of it basically solar, right? And what are the mineral requirements to achieve that? And so he actually did this and crunched these numbers. And basically, I mean, the long and short of it is the planet doesn't have even remotely close to achieving a fraction of that in terms of copper and vanadium and manganese and cobalt and lithium. So this idea of transitioning entirely away from fossil fuel energy towards renewables or anything and everything other than fossil fuels, he's basically saying like it's not going to happen. And it's not really my opinion. It's looking at the actual mineral endowment of the planet and what we can accomplish. Now, it makes a couple of assumptions. One of those is that we continue to live the way that we are. And
safe assumption. I think we'd only live so right now, and this is an outdated stat, and then I'll let you get back to it, but
yeah,
outdated stat a little bit, but America uses over 20% of the energy on Earth, which is not proportional to our human beings that live on Earth.
sure.
And America's not going to cut back. Everyone else wants to live how Americans live. Like that's the goal. So human beings will continue to live how human beings live, and we will continue to be greedy and materialistic and all those things. So that's a safe assumption to make. I'll let you continue now.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, not a lot of people will make voluntary changes to their lifestyle in a contracting manner until and unless they're forced to by whatever circumstances. So I don't know. The interviews that I listened to him were from a number of months ago, so I don't know where he stands now. He's definitely in the camp of looking at the statistics. As far as nuclear, he's like, it's absolutely essential, but it's not going to solve all the problems. And he highlights things like, if we double nuclear, the waste becomes untenable. It's like, no, that's not even close. So I can appreciate the effort that he's done to at least get this big picture, but it's crazy. It's like, so part of it would be, batteries, like vanadium flow batteries are kind of this big hopeful future of grid scale battery storage, which would allow us to have renewables as the majority of a grid, potentially. That in order to achieve that 2050 goal, he basically said in the next 20 years, we'd have to mine more vanadium out of the earth every year for 20 years than we've mined in the history of mining vanadium on the planet. So there's not only is there not enough of it, but the mining revolution that is going to happen to support renewables and the energy storage buffering that they require is absolutely off the charts. And most people don't understand that. And honestly, most people that are kind of on the green environmental left that are concerned about the environment and in favor of a massive push into renewables are also against mining. They think that mining is bad for the planet, and in some cases it is. But we're gonna have to absolutely rape the planet for minerals in order to achieve these goals. And the thing that drives me insane is, where's the conversation about conservation? Like, what happened to that conversation
What do you mean? The convers around
about
conversation?
conservation of energy? It's like it's almost off the table. It's like everything has been become so myopic around carbon and climate that we're trying to electrify everything without necessarily understanding what that means and what is required to achieve that. You know, I'm in California, and for better or for worse, we've got one remaining nuclear power plant at Diablo Canyon. It provides about 10% of the electricity for the whole state. It provides something like 30% of the clean energy in the state. And we've got more electric cars than any other state here. And I think right now the penetration into the car market for electric vehicles is less than 5%, but growing quickly.
Yeah.
Last summer, you had the governor of California ask people to not charge their electric cars between the hours of 5 and 9 p.m. because there wasn't enough electricity on the grid. And the reasoning for that is this push towards electric vehicles, and at the same time, a vast expansion of solar. And when solar stopped producing electricity towards the end of the day, but it's still freaking hot, everybody's running their AC, you can't charge the cars. And that's at a 5% penetration. And I just don't know. The math just doesn't add up.
Oh, damn. Yeah, no, it does not. That's pretty simple math. Oh, wow. I was feeling good. I was feeling good. Did you do this?
I mean, look, the solutions are there. It's just a matter of politics aligning with those solutions and
Yeah,
supporting for it. And public sentiment has a lot to do with it. I mean, just
absolutely.
look at Japan. I mean, the only country that's ever experienced a nuclear bomb, and also has experienced the most recent nuclear power accident with Fukushima, now is majority in support of expanding nuclear energy.
Yeah, that is amazing, actually. It speaks to their culture.
Right.
Culture is such a, I mean, obviously, I have a friend who, the quote that he gave around human beings, like, I don't think one group of people is better than another group of people. I think human beings are human beings, but cultures are different. And
Right.
how does a culture form? I have no idea, but I do think there's better cultures and worse cultures. And it's incredible that I don't even know what it is. Like they formed a culture that has been able to wrap its mind around. I want to say common sense, math,
Mm.
and efficiency, and that is amazing because that I couldn't imagine that any state. You can go California or Texas, whatever it is. Like I cannot imagine a Fukushima type accident happening, and ever considering nuclear being part of that. As long as those people lived until those 10-year-olds were gone. That is actually truly an amazing compliment and feat of the Japanese culture. Because if, like you said, it's all public sentiment. Because politicians, they everything they do is just public sentiment, and you see it extremely so in Canada, here as well. But I think a great example of COVID in the Canadian system, every single decision that was made is correlated directly, one for one, with poll results. It was one of the most blatant. I wish I had the charts to show here. It was one of the most blatant signs of it. Although it's not a Canadian thing, but it happens everywhere. But it was one of the most blatant ones I've ever seen. Of like, it is literally, I am just gonna get the approval ratings. That's all I want. So how do you?
Right.
It's crazy the game that goes into it, the money that goes into it, because obviously there's billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars into oil and in America, and they're gonna have the money to go spread a message they want to spread. It's gonna help their bottom line and all of those things. Politics is we'll go down a rabbit hole for hours, but to me that's the trick here. That's the last piece of the puzzle is hey, we know what works. How do we get the people to hop on board and support this so when the politicians are running for election, they can say, I'm fully in support of
Right.
nuclear energy. Look at
Right.
what all the great things it's going to do. And
Right.
once we're there, it's 10 to 20 years to get everything built. And all of a sudden, I think that's the next boom of human well-being. Truly, it really did happen with oil, and that was the huge boom. And I'm excited to see, hopefully, in our lifetimes, this next boom of human well-being and particularly for third world countries. Actually, brings me to another question. All of these third world countries right now, they're in a really weird spot when politically, where it's like, hey, we're trying to go carbon neutral, and you're burning coal and you want to use fossil fuels. Like, well, yeah, right now there's people burning cow dung for energy, like for heat. Like, yeah, we want to use the most efficient, cheapest energy. Are there any projects underway in the poorer parts of Africa or Asia, maybe South America, that that are using nuclear energy? Any projects that have been planned so far or are being built? Do that you know about?
As far as actually being built in Africa, I believe that would only be Egypt at the moment. Is building a nuclear power plant. There's a number of countries that there's been news over the past 6 to 12 months that they are looking into nuclear. They're starting to have discussions with some of the countries that build nuclear. So a lot of the countries that don't have their own, let's say, nuclear engineering base will look to the South Koreans or the Japanese or the Americans or the French or the Chinese, or in some cases the Russians, to actually build and export nuclear power plants. The Russians actually have been historically the biggest exporters of nuclear reactors. In fact, they had and probably still have one of the biggest sort of export books as far as plans to build the plant. So they'll actually show up, construct the plant, train the workforce, in some cases operate the plant, provide the fuel, manage the waste, and
Wow.
sign on for the decommissioning. It's like a soup to nuts package, and
Yeah.
they're the ones that have been doing that. And the Chinese are doing that too. And finally, the Americans are trying to get a piece of that pie. The South Koreans are crushing it. They just built the Baraka, the 4-unit Baraka nuclear power plant in the United Arab Emirates, basically on time, on budget. So we are seeing some of these oil-rich countries in the Middle East building nuclear, which is quite interesting. South America, I believe Argentina just made a deal with the Chinese as well to build another reactor there. That's the extent of my knowledge there. I know Brazil is doing some uranium mining. I don't know if they announced any new builds. India is not necessarily third world, but they've got a lot of people in poverty.
Yeah.
They're going all out with nuclear. I think they're building, gosh, off the top of my head, something like 8 to 10 reactors in the next decade. So they've got a pretty
Oh, wow.
robust nuclear build out in India. And
That's
then
good. That's
China's
awesome.
going crazy with nuclear. They're trying to get to 200 gigawatts by 2035, and they've got 52 gigawatts right now of
Oh,
nuclear.
wow.
So they're talking about quadrupling their nuclear fleet in the next 13 years. It's just absolutely insane.
Wow.
Uh, like 10 reactors a year is what they're shooting for a year in China. Yeah.
If anyone can do it,
Yeah.
they've always had the best industrial. I'm stuck on the word culture here, but that's probably not the right word. But for lack of a better word, best industrial culture of any country. That was actually even during Mao's China, they were able to build infrastructure super quickly and it was good infrastructure. It wasn't falling apart. Their downfall has been famine and
Mhm.
economics. But yeah, if anyone can do it, it's definitely the Chinese. That's a crazy goal though. That's wild. I'm wishing them the best. I would love to see India over the next 30 years have a ton of success, because if they can do that, I think they're gonna see, just personal opinion, I think you're gonna see just a great rise in the standard of living in India. And that would really be the one that shows the world, like, hey, look what this can do. Like, look what it
Mhm.
did for all of the poor people in this country. And that that one I'll definitely want to be keeping an eye on over the next couple of decades. And yeah, it's good news. It's good news. I'm feeling mostly good right now. So
That's good. Yeah. Happy to hear it.
yeah, no, I'm very, very happy to have this conversation. I feel like there's so many more routes we can go down. And honestly, I do love some conspiracy theories. The start of this podcast, well, I guess it was really vending machines, but the start of like the good of Twitter, it's obviously with in the investing realm, but it was really my AMC investment. I got on Twitter because of AMC,
Hmm.
and I wanted to learn how to trade and how to really invest in all these things. And there were just some really, really smart people that actually traded the way you would trade. And that's actually how I trade now. I have my long-term stocks and 401ks and like that, but all the money I have outside of that in the stock market, it really is just very technical based. I'll have Google alerts set up for some companies that I just want to keep on top of, and some industries I want to keep on top of, but it's very mostly technical based, and I was just learning from people like that. And AMC was a conspiracy like through and through, especially if you ask media, especially if you ask CNBC and all those guys. So it really did catch my interest there, and we'll see how that play works out. And it's really more of a revolution than anything, but we'll see how that works out as the banks are crumbling. And saying all that, do love me a good conspiracy theory. So the Kazakhstan, Jesus, Kazakhstan, conspiracy theory is Russia. Can you, going back here like 45 minutes, I think, can you expand on that? What was the theory there that with Russian mining and Kazakhstan mining?
Well, I guess the theory was that at the time they were 100% state-owned producer of uranium and still having pretty significant influence coming from Russia. And they still do at this point, although they've done honestly over the past decade or so, and maybe more, I would say the last 5 or 6 years since they've gone partially public, they've done a lot to be a reliable producer of uranium for global markets, including the West. And they've done a great job at that. And right now they're in the thick of it because they're sharing a border with Russia and a border with China. And they've got huge customers in the West. And it's difficult because they typically ship their uranium through the port of St. Petersburg, and that's gotten complicated. It's all kind of complex, but I don't think it's a very fleshed out theory. It's just kind of looking at a couple of elements, which are the result of, or one of the results of Kazakhstan's uranium production ramping was it just basically destroyed the uranium industry in the United States. And that, whether or not you think that's a political tool to have some sort of control on the energy. So even right now, the United States is dying to sanction Russian uranium, but they haven't done it yet because there's a handful of nuclear utilities that are depending on those deliveries for their operations.
Yeah.
Why? Because the United States doesn't have any enrichment right now. There's a little bit of enrichment, but it's owned by the British. And the other enrichment is working with Department of Energy contracts. So we don't have much of a robust fuel cycle. The United States nuclear utilities consume about 45 million pounds of uranium every year. We produce none. And so we're entirely 20% of the grid in this country is nuclear, 20% of the grid. And we don't produce any of the thing that we need to keep those plants running. And so, I mean, it's just more of a correlation. I don't know if it's really much of a conspiracy theory.
No, that makes sense though. I
Around,
mean,
yeah.
no, that makes sense. If I'm playing the Game of Thrones on the geopolitical level,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm Russia, I want to do that too. My same reasoning for why I think we all should know who blew up that pipeline, that Russian pipeline. It'd be a head scratcher for the Russians to blow up their own pipeline, in my mind.
Yeah.
And if it does make a ton of sense there that it's happening. We have uranium to mine and to produce in this country. I imagine Alaska or parts of the West, we have that, correct?
I don't know about Alaska. There's quite a bit in New Mexico and Arizona. There's some in Colorado. There's a decent amount in Wyoming, Nebraska, South Dakota. The only production that's happening right now is coming out of Wyoming. The deposits in New Mexico, there was a lot of uranium mining in New Mexico back in the 80s. It left a pretty bad legacy of uranium mining there, just with the large populations of indigenous people and the poor cleanup jobs that the mining companies did. So that's an unfortunate legacy there. No, but there's USGS reports saying they think there's north of 1 billion pounds of uranium in the Arizona Strip in northern Arizona alone.
Wow.
Will it ever be mined? I don't know, probably not. But we've got plenty of uranium. We've got a conversion facility in Illinois, and we've got some enrichment. So we have the ability to produce fuel for the domestic fleet. It's just in global capitalism, the prices went so low that the deposits in the United States were no longer viable.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. All right, I got a couple more questions for you that I ask everybody, and I'll let you go. I'll let you move on
Sure.
with I appreciate your time a lot. First one, if you could have any message that you could tell someone watching this, whether it's someone you're friends with or a random podcast listener, any book recommendations, anything at all that you would want to leave them with, what would you be leaving them with right now?
Ooh,
Good
gosh, I
heavy
haven't been
question.
asked a question like that in a long time. It's very
Take your time.
broad. It's very broad. I mean, I guess you found me on Twitter via the investing community, and I talk mostly about investing. So maybe I'll answer on that front just because it's top of mind. I think it's really, really important for everybody to find their own methods when it comes to investing and have their own due diligence and their own theses and their own execution, their own rules and their own time frames. Because when markets turn sour like they have over the last few months, you see a lot of kind of like infighting on Twitter. And honestly, I think most of it has to do with people just literally having different time frames and different goals without acknowledging those. So, for example, like somebody might really legitimately have long-term outlooks for those investments and might really legitimately and sincerely be welcoming the market pulling back for buying opportunities. And someone else might have bought the top and is pulling their hair out in frustration at that exact same moment. And those two people might be arguing with each other without recognizing that they're coming from entirely different places. So I think it's super, super important to find your own path in investing if you are an investor and you're watching this, to the extent that you can, and try to fail a lot, learn from those failures. That's a pretty cliche thing to say, but I think having big investing wins earlier in your investing career is really not a good thing. So I think it gives you a false sense of competence that most of the time the market will end up humbling you over a certain period of time.
Absolutely. I think everything
Yeah.
you said is great investment advice. It's also great life advice. Like my dad used to tell us all the time, like, or ask us all the time, like, what have you failed at lately? Which I know a ton of dads probably ask their kids. At least I hope they do, because it's a very important thing. It's a very, very important thing. And when yeah, and as far as the market humbling you, one of my personal favorite sayings that is coined by Troy, but it's I believe most people, not everybody, but most people, especially young people, when they're walking the line of a humble confidence, on one side is arrogance, and the other side is a lack of self-confidence. I'd say lean towards arrogance because the winds of life are gonna blow you the other way. They're
Mm.
blowing against you, and the market more than anything will blow you the other way. And yeah, I think that's great advice. I think it's great investment advice. I think it's great life advice. And then the last question I have for you, also a heavier question, but I think you'll be okay.
All right.
In your opinion, what's the meaning of life?
Oh man. To enjoy the humbling mystery that is existence as much as
Ooh,
possible.
I love that. Enjoy the humbling mystery that is existence. I haven't got that answer. That's very cool. I'm gonna have to sit on that one for a while.
I
Next
mean, because
hour or so.
for me, it's like it only takes a couple of moments of like sincere introspection to recognize that like everything is a freaking mystery beyond all explanation. You can say, oh, well, all of this started with the Big Bang. Well, the hell was the Big Bang? You're just making that up. Like
Yeah,
nobody knows what the hell is really going on when it comes down to it. And so I think about
absolutely.
that a lot, especially if I'm stressed out about something, about personal matters. Just like look up at the night sky and just go, what the fuck? Dwell on that for a second. Let it scare you and be okay with not knowing everything. And I think that's what makes the actual good connecting moments of life really rewarding, because nobody really knows what's going on. Nobody knows what's going to happen. I don't know. I enjoy that mystery. I understand it. It can be kind of frightening, and why people need to be able to define everything and latch on to outcomes and things like that. But I don't know. For some reason, that not knowing is comforting to me. So I try to go there pretty often.
No, I love that. I was actually I ended up there this last week. I was in Austin, Texas for South by Southwest, and
Nice.
one of my buddies lives down there. That's like our one time a year we all go to see him for obvious fun reasons. But we actually walking home one night, I ended up in that mindset of kind of looking up to the stars and just being like, dude, I have no idea. Like I don't know what's going on with the universe, with the world, with America, with my life, with my career. Like you make plans and you try and stick to them, but in my opinion, in my life, it's definitely been almost comforting, I would say as well. Of nobody knows. This is crazy. We are just a means for the universe coming to understand itself. Is one of the
Mm,
sayings I've heard that like a lot. Is we're all made of the universe. We're all made of the stardust, and the universe is, and we really are is the universe learning to understand itself, and the universe doesn't know what's going on. Because so it's one of those things that for me it is comforting to hear, especially and to think about, especially as a young professional where 20 somethings are really trying to figure out, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with my life the rest of this life? And you're kind of being hit in the face with reality for the first time, whether you're 18 going into the real world, or some friends of mine are literally just now hitting it, getting out of law school and medical school and stuff. And eventually it hits you. So it's definitely for me, it's almost a comforting thought. It really is. But on
yeah.
that note, I will let you go. I'll let you get on with your day and your nights. It seems like you were busy, so I appreciate you making the time. I've loved this conversation. I look forward to staying in contact, and I look forward to staying updated on uranium and nuclear power plants. I have some more Google alerts to add to my long list I have here. It's like how I start every morning, just an hour of Google alerts. So
Oh, wow.
I'm excited to
Nice.
add to it.
Nice. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to staying in touch as well. I
Of
appreciate the
course.
conversation.
Of course, yeah, I've enjoyed it a ton. I will talk to you soon. Have a great night, Justin.
You as well. Thanks, Troy.
All right, bye.
Cheers.